The bell rope lay in the dust before sunrise. Hannah Keene found it stretched across the schoolhouse steps like a dead snake. Cut clean through near the knot. The lower end still carried the marks of small hands. Smooth from years of children pulling it too hard when lessons were done. The upper end hung useless from the little wooden tower above the roof. For a while, she only stood there. Copperfield Crossing was still half asleep. A mule shifted behind the blacksmith shop. Somewhere near the stage road, a wagon wheel creaked under a load of hay that had come too late and cost too much. The sky was pale over the eastern hills, the color of cold ashes. Hannah bent and picked up the rope. Dust clung to her gloves. She did not look toward the church yet. She knew what waited there. By noon, 60 or more people would sit in the pews. Not to bless a wedding, but to see if the town's cursed schoolmistress could walk down an aisle without breaking. That was what they called her when they thought she could not hear. Cursed. Bad look. The woman no decent man had ever wanted. She had learned long ago that small towns did not need proof. They only needed a story told often enough. Beside the hitching post, a sheet of paper had been nailed into the wood. County marriage notice. The ink was official. Black and square. Beneath it, someone had written 3 words in charcoal. About time. Hannah. She read it once. Then she reached up, pulled the notice free, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the pocket of her gray dress. She could have left the rope where it was. She could have walked straight to the church, said the words required of her, and let the school bell remain silent. Nobody would have blamed her. Not today. But the children would come Monday. And children noticed when grown people broke things and pretended nothing had happened. Hannah dragged the water barrel closer to the schoolhouse wall, climbed onto it, and reached for the loose end still hanging from the tower. The barrel rocked under her boots. She steadied herself with one hand against the sun-cracked boards. "You'll fall doing that?" The voice came from behind her. Hannah did not turn. "If I fall," she said, "it will at least be for something useful." A man stepped into the yard. Wade Marston wore a dark hat, a trail coat, and the look of someone who had not slept much. His ranch lay 3 miles west, beyond the dry creek bed and the red slope where the grass had burned brown before July was half gone. She knew his name because everyone did. Low Star Ranch. Good horses. Bad water year. Banknote due before winter. And now, by county arrangement, her husband before the sun reached noon. Wade looked from the cut rope to the schoolhouse tower, then to the hitching post where the notice had been. Someone did that this morning. Or last night. Hannah said, "Who?" She tied the broken ends together with slow fingers. "In this town, Mr. Marston. Cruel hands usually belong to brave people only in the dark." He said nothing. That was better than pity. She pulled the knot tight. The rope was shorter now. A child would have to stretch to reach it. Still, it would ring. Hannah climbed down from the barrel. Her dress had dust on the hem, and one glove had split at the thumb. She brushed both as best she could. Wade was still watching her. "You should be getting ready," he said. "I am ready. For a wedding. For whatever this is." The words sat between them. From the church. The first bell rang. Not the school bell. The church bell. Lower. Heavier. And less forgiving. It rolled through Copperfield Crossing and woke the windows. The wagons. The whispering mouths. Wade looked toward the sound. "I didn't ask for this," he said. Hannah folded her hands in front of her. "Neither did I. I'll treat you fairly." She looked at him then. Really looked. He seemed like a man built more from weather than charm. There was dust on his boots, a tired line at his mouth, and a kind of anger in his eyes that did not seem aimed at her. "Fairly is a start," she said. A boy's slate pencil lay near the schoolhouse step, snapped in half. Hannah picked it up and placed both pieces on the windowsill. Wade noticed. "You keep broken things. Only the ones that can still be used." For the first time, something in his face changed. Not softness. Not yet. Recognition. Maybe. The church bell rang again. Hannah turned toward the road. The town was waking now. Curtains shifted. Doors opened. Somewhere, someone laughed too quietly. She began walking. Behind her, the shortened school rope moved in the morning wind. It's fresh, not dark against the pale wood. Wade fell into step beside her. Not close enough to claim her. Not far enough to deny her. At the corner, Hannah touched the folded notice in her pocket. She had thought the worst thing waiting for her that day was the wedding. She was wrong. Because someone in Copperfield Crossing had cut the bell rope before sunrise. And whoever had done it had not been trying to stop a wedding. They had been trying to stop her. The church was full before Hannah reached the steps. That alone told her enough. Copperfield Crossing was not a town that filled pews easily. Not unless there was a burial. A vote. Or something painful enough to be remembered over supper. Today had brought all three kinds of silence under one roof. Wade opened the church door. The smell of heat, candle wax, old pine, and pressed clothes came out to meet them. Hannah stepped inside first. Heads turned. No one spoke. But the room made a sound all the same. A shifting of skirts. A boot heel against the floor. A low breath held too long. Reverend Amos Vale stood at the front with his Bible open. Behind him, the window showed a strip of pale blue sky and the dry hills beyond town. Edwin Quill stood near the back wall. Hat in hand. His coat too fine for the weather. The county relief seal shone on the folder under his arm. He watched Wade and Hannah the way a banker watched a scale. Maribel Quaid sat in the second row. Gloved hands folded. Face calm as milk gone sour. Hannah saw hair. Then she looked away. Wade walked beside her down the aisle. Not too fast. Not too slow. He did not offer his arm. And she did not ask for it. That may have been the kindest thing he could have done. They stopped before the Reverend. Sunlight fell across the floorboards between them. Thin and hard. Hannah could feel the eyes behind her. She knew some of those eyes had watched her teach their children. Some had watched her bury her mother. Some had watched her stand alone at Miles Tabor's grave years before. Then turned that grief into something ugly because sorrow frightened them. Reverend Vale cleared his throat. Dearly beloved. The words moved over her without settling. Hannah answered when she had to. So did Wade. His voice was low. Steady. Not tender. Not cruel. When the Reverend asked whether Wade Marston took Hannah Keene as his wife, Wade looked at her before he answered. For 1 second. Hannah thought he might stop it. She would not have blamed him. Then he said, I do. The words landed like a nail driven straight. When her turn came, Hannah kept her chin lifted. I do. Someone in the back whispered. Poor man? Someone else made a small sound. Quickly covered. Hannah smiled. It was not joy. It was not surrender. It was a door closed from the inside. Reverend Vale pronounced them married. No one clapped. A few people breathed as if the show had ended too soon. Wade turned to face the room with her. That was when Hannah felt it. The old weight. Familiar as winter. They were not looking at a bride. They were looking at a town joke that had finally been given a last name. Her fingers curled once against her skirt. Then Wade stepped half a pace forward. Not in front of her fully. Just enough that the whispering stopped. His eyes moved over the pews. Slow and flat. Nobody spoke after that. Outside. The summer light hit hard. Horses shifted along the rail. Dust rolled under wagon wheels. The church bell swung once more behind them. Then went still. Wade helped Hannah into the wagon. She let him. Only because every window along the street was watching. And she had no wish to give them another story. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. For a while. They rode without speaking. Copperfield Crossing passed on both sides. The dry goods store. The blacksmith shed. The small jail with one barred window. The stage office with 2 cracked benches out front. Near the water trough. 3 children stood watching. One of them was from her upper class. Little Ben Caro. He lifted his hand halfway. Then dropped it when his mother pulled him back. Hannah saw. She said nothing. When they reached the edge of town, Wade slowed the horses. I meant what I said earlier. He told her. I'll treat you fairly. You already said that. I'm saying it again because this town has a way of hearing one thing and making another out of it. That is true. He looked ahead at the road. I don't expect you to pretend. Good. I don't expect you to act grateful. Better. A faint line moved near his mouth. It was almost not a smile. Then it was gone. Low Star Ranch came into view 20 minutes later. Sitting below the slope, where the brown grass met a thin line of cottonwoods. The house was solid, but tired. The barn leaned a little into the wind. Beyond it, a water tank stood under a patched shade roof. Its side marked with chalk lines. Hannah noticed the lines first. "Your water is lower than Quill reported," she said. Wade turned to her. "You saw Quill's report. I wrote part of the district copy." His hands tightened slightly on the reins. And someone rounded your numbers upward." The wagon rolled to a stop. For the first time that day, Wade looked at her not as a problem placed in his path, but as a person holding a match near dry grass. "Who?" he asked. Hannah looked at the water tank, then back toward the town road. "I don't know yet." A gust of wind moved across the yard. On the porch rail, dust lifted and settled again. Wade stepped down first, then turned to help her. This time, before taking his hand, Hannah touched the folded marriage notice still hidden in her pocket. He noticed that too, but he did not ask. Not yet. By the third morning, Hannah understood that Low Star Ranch was not failing from laziness. It was failing by inches. A cracked hinge on the smokehouse door. A trough patched twice but still leaking at the seam. Hay stacked too low for October. Fence wire bought cheap and stretched too far. Men who ate fast because work was waiting, then stood slowly because their backs had not forgiven yesterday. Wade Marston had kept the ranch alive by force of will. But will did not fill a water tank. Hannah stood beside the rain barrel behind the kitchen with a slate pencil in one hand. The barrel had chalk marks down the side. Old ones nearly washed away and new ones cut too high to be honest. She touched the top mark with her finger. "Who keeps these?" she asked. "Ellis Boone." Wade's foreman looked at the barrel as if it had personally offended him. "County man came through last month," he said. "Quill's deputy. And he marked this. Near enough." Near enough is how a ranch dies politely. Ellis looked at her then. He was older than Wade by 10 years. Narrow-faced, with a left shoulder that did not sit quite right. The kind of man who had learned not to trust new voices until weather proved them. "You know water?" he asked. "I know numbers," Hannah said. "And I know when a mark is drawn above the stain it claims to measure." Ellis leaned closer. The old water line was plain when a person knew to look for it. A pale ring around the wood. Almost 2 inches below the county chalk. "Well?" he said slowly. "That ain't friendly." "No," Hannah said. "It is not." By noon, she had walked the yard. The pump, the lower trough, and the storage shed where Wade kept the water rotation tags. Each tag was a thin piece of wood burned with a ranch name and date. The county used them to decide which wagons took water from the public well when the dry weeks ran long. Low Star's tag sat beneath Quaid Range and Harlow Bend. That made no sense. Quaid Range had 2 spring-fed ponds. Harlow Bend had sold half its cattle in June. Low Star still carried more mouths and less water than both. Hannah set the tags in a row on the kitchen table when Wade came in. He stopped at the doorway. Behind him, dust clung to his coat and the brim of his hat. He looked from the tags to her face. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been married 3 days," she answered. "I thought I should begin earning my scandal." Ellis made a cough that might have been a laugh and walked out before Wade could look at him. Wade came to the table. Hannah pointed to the first tag. "Quaid Range is receiving first draw every 3rd day. They have more cattle. They reported more cattle," she said. "That is not the same thing." His face changed. She pointed to the second. "Harlow Bend no longer needs second draw. Their herd count changed after the July sale." "How do you know that?" "The children talk." Wade stared. Hannah picked up the slate beside her. "Children hear everything and understand more than adults think. Molly Harlow wrote an arithmetic problem last week about 46 cows leaving for Miles City. She used her father's exact number because she was proud she could subtract it." For a moment, Wade said nothing. Then he took off his hat and set it on the chair. "What are you saying?" "I am saying Low Star should have first draw before sundown tomorrow. I am also saying someone in Quill's office knows that and chose otherwise." The room went quiet except for the stove ticking. Wade looked toward the window, where the west pasture lay brown under a hard sky. "I'll ride into town." "No." His eyes returned to her. "No. If you ride in angry, they will call you a husband defending his wife's fussing. If I go in with figures, route dates, schoolhouse herd counts, And rain marks. They will have to call it a correction. And if they don't, then we learn who benefits from refusing. That answer settled heavier than argument. Before Wade could speak, a shout came from the yard. Cody Vale, the youngest hand, was bent near the trough, one arm around the rail. His face had gone pale under the dust. Ellis reached him first. Wade was right behind. Hannah followed with a bucket and a clean cloth. Too much sun? Wade asked. Maybe. Ellis said. Maybe bad water from the creek crossing. Hannah looked at Cody's eyes. Then at the mud on his boots. Bring him inside, she said. Not the bunkhouse. Kitchen floor. Shade and boiled water first. Send someone for Dr. Bell. Wade looked at her. She did not raise her voice. Now. Wade. He moved. For the next hour. The ranch obeyed her because she gave no one room not to. Ellis boiled water. Wade sent a rider. Another hand cleaned the trough. Hannah kept Cody awake with short questions and a damp cloth at his neck. When the boy finally stopped shaking, Wade stood by the kitchen door, watching her fold the cloth with hands that were steady only because she made them be. You've done this before, he said quietly. I've taught through fever seasons, she said. A schoolhouse teaches a person what panic costs. Outside, wind dragged dust across the yard. On the table, the water tags still waited in their wrong order. Wade looked at them again. Then at Hannah. For the first time since the wedding. He did not look trapped by her presence. He looked like he was beginning to understand that someone had placed her in his path without knowing what kind of woman they had handed him. And somewhere in Copperfield Crossing, a man with county ink on his fingers had made a mistake. He had assumed Hannah Keene would stay quiet. The harvest market came 3 days after Cody's fever broke. Copperfield Crossing dressed itself up as best it could. Red cloth hung from the dry goods porch. Pumpkins sat in a crooked line beside the church fence. A fiddle played near the stage office. Though the tune sounded thin in the dry air, women set pies beneath flour sack covers. And men stood around the feed wagons pretending they had not come to trade rumors. Wade did not want to go. Hannah did. Staying away will make them think they were right, she said, pinning her hat before the small mirror by the door. Wade stood behind her, hat in hand. About what? That I can be pushed out of my own town. He had no answer for that. So they went. The moment they stepped from the wagon, the market changed. Not enough for anyone to admit it, but enough for Wade to feel it. Conversations thinned. Eyes moved. A woman near the jam table leaned toward another woman and whispered behind her glove. Hannah walked as if she heard none of it. She stopped by the school stall first. 2 children ran to her with slate boards tucked under their arms. One showed her a column of sums. Hannah bent slightly, corrected a number with her finger, and smiled. Not the hard smile. A real one. Wade watched the child smile back. Bright and unafraid. And felt something quiet settle in his chest. Then Maribel Quaid appeared beside the honey table. She wore a dark blue dress too heavy for the heat, and a bonnet tied sharp beneath her chin. Her husband, Councilman Quaid, stood several steps behind her, saying nothing. That was the way men like him often helped. They let someone else sharpen the knife. Mrs. Marston, Maribel said. Hannah turned. Mrs. Quaid. How brave of you to come. Wade felt the words before he understood them. Hannah's face did not change. It is a market. I needed salt. A few people nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Maribel looked at Wade. Then back at Hannah. Of course. A married woman has household duties now. Even a marriage made by county ink must need salt. The fiddle missed a note. Wade took one step forward. Hannah's hand touched his sleeve. Lightly. A warning. Not a plea. Maribel smiled as if she had been given permission to continue. I only hope the children do not become confused, she said. First you teach them virtue. Then you stand before them as a woman taken into a household because a ranch needed water and hay. Hannah's hand fell from Wade's sleeve. The crowd went very still. Maribel's voice softened, which made it worse. Some of us remember Miles Tabor, too. Poor boy. Some women do seem to carry weather with them. There it was. 11 years folded into one sentence. Wade turned cold from the inside out. He had heard whispers about Miles. But not from Hannah. Not yet. He only knew the name from Irene Shaw at the dry goods counter. who had told him enough to make his hands tighten around a coil of rope until his knuckles ached. Miles Tabor had loved Hannah Keene. Miles Tabor had died on a frozen river survey. And Copperfield Crossing had made a curse out of an accident, because cruelty was easier than fear. Hannah stood in front of Maribel Quaid. And for the first time since Wade had known her, the smile vanished. Not slowly. It simply went out. Her face was bare then. Tired. Young and old at once. Every word she had swallowed for years seemed to stand behind her eyes. Waiting for one more push. Wade wanted to speak. He wanted to strip Maribel's polished calm down to the bone of what it was. But Hannah looked at him once. No. That was all the look said. Then she turned from the honey table and walked away through the crowd. No one stopped her. Wade watched her go. Then looked back at Maribel. His voice was low enough that no one could call it shouting. But clear enough for every person nearby to hear. Mrs. Quaid. If you have business with my wife's teaching, bring it before the proper board. If you have business with grief, learn some respect before you speak of dead men. Her mouth tightened. Careful. Mr. Marston. I am being careful. Then he followed Hannah. He found her beyond the last wagon. Near the dry creek bed. She stood with her arms folded tight, looking at the empty channel where water should have been. I told you not to fight for me, she said. I didn't fight, I answered. That is how it starts. He stood beside her, leaving space between them. Then tell me how to stand there and hear that without becoming the kind of man who does nothing. She did not answer right away. The wind moved dust along the creek stones. At first, she said, I thought if I smiled long enough, they would get tired. Then I thought if I worked hard enough, they would be ashamed. Then I thought if I married, if I had a name beside mine, maybe I could walk through a market and belong. Her voice stayed quiet. That made it hurt more. And today? Wade asked. Today I remembered that a name beside mine does not matter if the town still thinks I am something to be endured. Wade looked toward the market, where the fiddle had started again. Softer now. You belong at Low Star, he said. She turned to him. Do I? There was no anger in it. Only a tired question. Before he could answer, a rider came hard from town, dust rising behind the horse. It was Ben Caro's older brother. With a folded paper in his hand, he stopped near the creek bed and held it out to Hannah. Ma'am, he said. Breathless. They posted it at the schoolhouse. Hannah took the paper. Wade saw the county seal first. Then the words. District Review of Teacher Fitness and Moral Standing. Hannah folded the paper once. Her hands did not shake. But the smile did not come back. The district examiner arrived in Copperfield Crossing 2 weeks later in a black wagon with iron-rimmed wheels and no driver beside her. Her name was Mrs. Ruth Ainsley. She wore a brown traveling coat, carried her own satchel, and stepped down in front of the schoolhouse like a woman who had crossed enough bad roads to stop being impressed by them. Maribel Quaid was already waiting. So was her lawyer from Billings, a narrow man named Ferris with clean cuffs and careful eyes. Edwin Quill stood near the schoolhouse door, holding the county folder against his chest. He looked less certain than usual. Wade noticed that. Hannah noticed everything else. She noticed the children gathered at the fence, kept back by their parents. She noticed Irene Shaw from the dry goods store standing under the cottonwood with her arms folded. She noticed Ellis Boone beside the hitching rail, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in town, but unwilling to leave. And she noticed the bell rope above the schoolhouse door, still shortened, still tied with her rough knot. Mrs. Ainsley looked at the crowd, then at the schoolhouse. We will not hold this review in the church, she said. Maribel blinked. The church has more room. The matter concerns a teacher, Mrs. Ainsley said. We will sit where she teaches. That was the first small shift. Hannah felt it. Inside, the room smelled of chalk, wood smoke, slate dust, and cold iron from the little stove. The benches had been pushed back. A table stood at the front, where Hannah usually kept her primers. Ferris laid out Maribel's petition. He spoke first. He said Hannah Keene Marston had entered a marriage for financial advantage. He said such an arrangement called her moral influence into question. He said the children of Copperfield Crossing deserved a teacher whose household did not begin in County Bargain. His voice was smooth. That made the words colder. Hannah sat still through all of it. Wade stood near the back wall. He had promised her he would not speak unless asked. It was one of the hardest promises he had ever kept. When Ferris finished, Mrs. Ainsley turned to Hannah. "You may answer." Hannah stood. She did not smile. "I did enter marriage under pressure," she said. "So did my husband." "That is true." A stir moved through the room. Maribel's mouth curved slightly. Hannah placed a stack of copybooks on the table. "This is Ben Caro's arithmetic from last spring. This is Molly Harlow's reading copy. This is the attendance record from Fever Month, when 6 children missed class and 4 were taught at home. These are not proof of my virtue. They are proof of my work." Mrs. Ainsley opened the first book. The room quieted. Hannah laid down a folded map next. "This is the water rotation chart I copied from county records. These marks show Low Star Ranch was placed below 2 ranches with stronger supply. This correction was filed last week." Edwin Quill shifted his weight. Mrs. Ainsley looked up. "Mr. Quill, did your office prepare the original rotation?" Quill swallowed. "My deputy prepared it." "Under your seal?" "Yes." Another small shift. Wade saw it move through the benches like wind over grass. Then he stepped forward only far enough to set one folded paper on Hannah's table. The marriage notice. The one torn from the hitching post on their wedding morning. The charcoal words were still there. "About time." "Hannah." Hannah looked at it. Then at Wade. He said quietly, "You told me not to answer for you. I won't. But this belongs in the room." Mrs. Ainsley unfolded the notice. For the first time, Maribel looked uncertain. One of the children at the window whispered something and was hushed. Irene Shaw came forward next. She told them how Hannah had taught through snow years, sickness years, and years when half the town whispered behind her back. Burke Calloway spoke of schoolbooks paid for without anyone knowing. Ellis, stiff and plain, told how Hannah's water correction had kept Low Star from selling weak cattle too early. No one made speeches. They just told what they had seen. At last, Mrs. Ainsley turned to Maribel. "Mrs. Quaid, your petition, says Mrs. Marston, is unfit, because this marriage began as a county arrangement." Maribel lifted her chin. "Yes?" Mrs. Ainsley looked at Edwin Quill. "And who suggested that arrangement?" The room went still. Quill's face tightened. "I presented available legal options to both parties." He did not answer at once. Hannah looked down at the copybooks, then lifted her head. "I was told no one else would come," she said. "I was told this was the only useful thing left for me to be." The words did not break. That made them stronger. Wade's hands closed once at his sides, then opened. Mrs. Ainsley gathered the papers slowly. "This review will be recorded," she said. "The petition is denied. Mrs. Hannah Marston remains teacher of Copperfield Crossing School." No one clapped. Not this time. But Ben Caro slipped through the door before his mother could stop him and placed his slate on Hannah's desk. On it, written in crooked chalk, were 4 words. "We need our teacher." Hannah touched the slate with 2 fingers. Outside, the wind moved the shortened bell rope against the schoolhouse wall. For the first time in years, the town had heard the truth in the room where she had been trying to teach it. Spring came late to Copperfield Crossing. It did not arrive with flowers or soft songs. It came with mud in the wagon ruts, green shoots under fence wire, and water running thin but steady through the creek bed west of town. Men who had spent winter measuring hay by the armload began looking at the sky without anger. Women opened windows. Children came to school with slates under their arms and dust already on their shoes. The schoolhouse looked different by then. Not new. Nothing in Copperfield Crossing became new all at once. But the broken step had been replaced. The stovepipe had been cleaned. The front wall had been whitewashed by 3 fathers who did not say much while they worked. Irene Shaw had brought curtains sewn from old flower cloth. Ellis Boone had fixed the gate latch and pretended it was not a gift. Near the door, a fresh county notice hung under glass. Water rotation to be posted publicly each month. 2 signatures required. Low Star Ranch had been restored to its proper draw before the first thaw. The relief contract had been renewed through harvest. Quaid Range no longer took first water by habit. And Edwin Quill no longer carried his county seal like a private weapon. He still had his office, but not the same silence around him. That mattered. In a small town, power did not always leave in handcuffs. Sometimes it left when people stopped lowering their eyes. Maribel Quaid still came to church. She still wore dark gloves and sat straight-backed near the front. But when she spoke now, fewer women leaned close to listen. When she passed the schoolyard, the children did not step aside. And when Hannah's name was said, no one laughed quickly enough to make it easy. Even Miles Tabor's name changed. It did not become a clean thing. Grief never did. But people stopped saying it like a warning. They stopped using a dead man as proof that a living woman carried bad luck in her bones. Hannah noticed. She did not thank them for it. Some wrongs did not deserve gratitude just because they finally stopped. She stood in the schoolyard before the first bell of term, holding the old rope in her hands. It was still the same rope. Shorter now. Scarred where it had been cut. Darker at the knot she had tied on the morning of her wedding. Beside it lay a new length of rawhide cord. Braided, clean and strong. Wade had brought it from Low Star before sunrise. I had Roelio help with the braid. He said. My hands make ugly work of small things. Hannah touched the rawhide with her thumb. It is not ugly. No. Wade said. But he did the better part. She looked at him then. He stood near the hitching post. Hat in hand. In the same place where that notice had once been nailed. The post itself had been replaced. Fresh cedar. No charcoal words. No county paper. Just clean wood catching low morning light. Children gathered by the fence. Pretending they were not watching. Their parents stood farther back. Not all of Copperfield had come. Some doors in town would stay closed for a long time. Some pride took years to starve. But enough people stood there. Enough to matter. Mrs. Ainsley's decision had not made the town kind overnight. It had changed the shape of its silence. People were slower now before they spoke of Hannah. Some had begun bringing their children early. Others had left small things on the schoolhouse step through the winter. Kindling. Chalk. Apples dried in cloth sacks. A tin of lamp oil with no name tied to it. Apologies. Frontier style. Small. Awkward. Useful. Hannah accepted them the same way. Wade stepped closer. Hannah. He said. The children stopped whispering. She turned fully toward him. He looked more nervous than he had facing drought. County men. Or a herd moving wrong in bad weather. That first wedding, he said, was made out of need. Mine. Yours. The county's. This one, if you'll have it, would not be. The yard went still. He did not kneel. That was not his way. He only held out a plain silver ring. Simple and worn smooth at the edge. My mother's. He said. She left it when she went east. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it. Hannah looked at the ring. Then at Wade. And what are you doing with it now? Choosing. He said. The word was quiet. It reached her all the same. For years. Hannah Keene had been a story people used when they wanted to feel safer than grief. Bad look. Cursed woman. Old maid. County wife. Arrangement. Now Wade Marston stood before her with no contract in his hand. No relief seal behind him. No bargain waiting. Only the ring. Only the choice. Hannah took it. Not quickly. Not with trembling drama. She took it the way she had taken everything that mattered in her life. With care. With thought. And with both feet planted in the dirt. Yes. She said. A child near the fence let out a breath too loud. And a few grown people smiled before they could stop themselves. Wade slid the ring onto her finger. Then Hannah picked up the old rope and the new rawhide cord. Together. She and Wade tied them into one line. The old cut remained visible. It did not disappear. But the new braid held it strong. She reached up and pulled. The school bell rang over Copperfield Crossing. Clear. Plain. Alive. It rolled across the schoolyard. Past the church roof. Over the dry goods store. Beyond the trough where horses lifted their heads. And out toward Low Star Ranch. Where spring light lay across grass that had nearly been lost. Hannah listened until the sound faded. Then, she opened the schoolhouse door. The children went in first. Wade stayed outside. One hand resting on the fresh cedar post. Watching her as if the whole morning had finally put something right that words never could. Hannah looked back once. This time. When she smiled. It was not armor. It was not forgiveness for everyone. It was home. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.